The snow fell softly on the streets of Bethlehem, Vermont, coating the picturesque town in a blanket of white. Twinkling lights adorned every window, and the aroma of fresh pine and spiced cider drifted through the air. It was Christmas Eve, and the entire town seemed alive with the magic of the season. Families gathered in warm homes, carolers sang in the town square, and children laughed as they skated on the frozen pond. Yet, in the grandest house overlooking the town, Benjamin Harrington sat alone in his study, staring at the crackling fire with vacant eyes. Ben was a man of contradictions. To the world, he was the epitome of success, owner of Harrington Hotels, a chain of luxurious properties known across the country. But within the high walls of his estate, he was a man haunted by grief. The tragedy that had struck 25 years earlier had left scars that no amount of wealth could heal. On a Christmas Eve long ago, Ben's wife, Caroline, and their infant son, Samuel, had been taken from him in a car accident on icy roads. Since then, Christmas was not a season of joy but a reminder of everything he had lost. Tonight, Ben had tried to bury himself in work, attending a business meeting that should have kept him distracted. But it had only irritated him, and the festive spirit of the town below felt like an unwelcome intrusion. He needed air. Grabbing his coat, he stepped outside and walked toward the town square, his polished shoes crunching on the snow-covered streets. Bethlehem's charm was undeniable, even to Ben. The lampposts wrapped in garlands, the sound of bells echoing from the church tower, and the children's laughter reminded him of the life he once had. He avoided eye contact with the townsfolk who recognized him. Small talk and Christmas greetings were not what he needed tonight. As he turned a corner near the square, a figure caught his eye. A young woman huddled on a bench, clutching a bundle of blankets. At first, he intended to walk past. It wasn't his business, but something made him stop. The woman looked up, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes wide and pleading. In her arms was a baby, no older than a few months, bundled tightly to shield him from the icy air. A handwritten sign lay propped against her knee. "Please help. We have nowhere to go." Ben froze. He had seen people in need before, but there was something about this woman that unsettled him. Her face, though pale and tired, stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. She didn't beg or speak. She only looked at him with quiet desperation. "Are you all right?" Ben found himself asking, his voice gruff but sincere. The woman hesitated before answering. We're just trying to keep warm. I don't want to bother anyone." "I'm sorry." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, and her words tugged at something deep inside him. He wanted to turn away, to leave her and the child to someone else's charity, but his feet refused to move. Instead, he removed his gloves and crouched in front of her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maggie," she replied, glancing down at the baby. "And this is Oliver." Ben's gaze dropped to the baby, who stirred slightly in his mother's arms. The little boy's tiny face peeked out from the blankets, his cheeks rosy from the cold. A pang of something unfamiliar struck Ben. Pity, perhaps, or recognition of how vulnerable they were. "You can't stay out here," he said, his tone firmer now. "It's too cold." "I don't have anywhere else," Maggie admitted. Her voice wavered, but she quickly composed herself. "We'll be fine." "No, you won't." Ben stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. He considered calling for help, police, a shelter, but something about the idea felt impersonal, even wrong. "Come with me." Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" "You can stay at my house for the night," Ben said. "I have plenty of space. It's not safe for you and the baby out here." She hesitated, clutching Oliver closer. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." "I don't know," Ben admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But I can't leave you out here." "So, are you coming or not?" Maggie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, thank you." As they walked through the snow-covered streets, Ben couldn't help but notice how fragile she looked. Her coat was too thin, her boots worn. The baby clung to her, and she held him like he was the only thing keeping her standing. When they reached his estate, Maggie gasped at the sight of the sprawling mansion, its grand windows glowing with warm light. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben didn't respond, pushing the door open and motioning for her to follow. Inside, the warmth enveloped them, and Maggie's eyes darted around, taking in the elegant furnishings and high ceilings. "Come in," Ben said, closing the door behind her. "Let's get you warmed up." Maggie hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. For the first time, Ben saw something beyond desperation in her eyes: hope. The grand foyer of Benjamin Harrington's estate was silent except for the faint crackling of the fire from the main sitting room. Maggie stood just inside the door, holding Oliver close as she looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the bitter cold they had just left behind. The polished marble floors, the glittering chandelier above, and the subtle aroma of cedar and cinnamon made her feel like she had stepped into another world, one she didn't belong to. Ben closed the door behind them, the sound echoing softly in the large space. He shrugged off his coat and hung it on a nearby rack before gesturing toward her. "You should take off your coat. It's warm in here." Maggie hesitated. The weight of the baby in her arms and the thin, worn coat she wore seemed to cling to her like armor, a reminder of the world she was used to. She wasn't sure if she could trust this man, this stranger who had swept her and her son off the streets into a home that looked like something out of a fairy tale. Still, the promise of warmth and safety, even for just one night, was too tempting to refuse. She slipped off the coat, revealing her thin sweater underneath, and Ben took it from her, hanging it beside his. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Maggie followed, her steps hesitant as she trailed behind him down a hallway. The house was even more impressive on the inside, with its vaulted ceilings, intricate moldings, and tasteful holiday decorations that adorned every corner. A massive Christmas tree stood in the living room, its ornaments sparkling in the firelight, though it looked as though it had been decorated by someone other than its owner. Maggie couldn't imagine Ben stringing lights or hanging garlands. He didn't seem the type. Ben led her into a cozy sitting room just off the main hall. "Sit down," he instructed, motioning to a plush armchair near the fire. "You and the baby need to warm up." Maggie settled into the chair slowly, adjusting Oliver in her arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of his blanket. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, her breath catching at how cold his skin still felt. Ben watched silently for a moment before disappearing into another room. When he returned, he carried a tray with a steaming mug and a plate of crackers and cheese. "I wasn't sure what you'd want," he said, setting the tray on the small table beside her. "But you need to eat something." Maggie looked up at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and caution. "Thank you." Ben nodded, his face unreadable as he moved to the opposite chair and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Oliver's soft breaths. Maggie sipped the hot drink. It was cocoa, rich and smooth, unlike anything she'd had in years. She took a bite of a cracker, realizing just how hungry she was. "You said your name was Maggie," Ben said, breaking the silence. "And the baby is Oliver. How old is he?" "For months," Maggie replied, her voice soft. She glanced down at her son, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "He's my everything." Ben studied her, his brow furrowing slightly. "And you don't have anyone else? No family?" Maggie shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. "No, it's just me and him." Ben didn't press further, though questions swirled in his mind. He wanted to know how someone so young, with a baby in her arms, had ended up on a snowy bench in the middle of the night. But he sensed that pushing her for answers now would do more harm than good. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. "You can stay here tonight," he said after a long pause. "We'll figure out something tomorrow." Maggie looked up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Why are you helping us?" The question caught Ben off guard. He considered it for a moment, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. He'd passed by countless people in need over the years without giving them a second thought. But something about Maggie and the baby had stopped him in his tracks. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but you shouldn't be out there. Especially not with a baby." Maggie studied him, as though trying to read the sincerity in his words. Eventually, she nodded. "Thank you," she said again, her voice trembling slightly. Ben stood abruptly, the weight of the moment feeling too heavy. "I'll have the guest room made up for you," he said, moving toward the door. "Stay here and finish your food." He left the room before she could respond, heading down the hall to find the housekeeper. As he walked, he tried to shake off the strange emotions that had begun to surface. He told himself he was only doing what any decent person would do, offering a mother and her child a safe place for the night. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about Maggie that stirred memories he'd buried long ago, memories he wasn't ready to face. In the sitting room, Maggie sat alone, cradling Oliver as she stared into the fire. The warmth of the room seeped into her skin, easing the cold that had gripped her for days. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile and fleeting, but real. She looked down at Oliver, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "We're okay," she whispered to him. "At least for tonight, we're okay." The guest room was larger than any place Maggie had ever called home. The bed, with its crisp white linens and thick quilted comforter, looked untouched, as though it belonged more in a magazine than in real life. A small crib had been brought in at Ben's request, placed carefully near the window. Maggie stood in the doorway for a long moment, her arms still cradling Oliver, as if stepping inside might make it all disappear. Ben stood behind her, his expression guarded. "It's not much," he said, as if the elegant room were anything less than luxurious. "But it'll do for the night." Maggie turned slightly to look at him. "It's more than I could ever ask for." "Thank you." Ben nodded, a short, almost dismissive gesture, and turned to leave. "If you need anything, I'll be down the hall. Just call." She watched as he walked away, his footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors, before stepping inside and gently closing the door behind her. Setting Oliver down in the crib, she tucked the blanket around him, her fingers lingering on his tiny hand. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of sleep, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he looked peaceful. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the snowy expanse beyond. The world outside felt like a dream, quiet, serene, and utterly unlike the chaos she had left behind. The memories threatened to rise, sharp and unforgiving, but she pushed them back. She couldn't think about that now. Instead, she focused on the present. For the first time in weeks, she and Oliver were safe. Down the hall, Ben sat in his study, nursing a glass of scotch as the firelight flickered across the room. His thoughts were a tangled mess, as though Maggie's arrival had stirred something he couldn't quite name. There was a familiarity about her, a shadow of someone he'd lost long ago. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo on the mantel, a picture of Caroline, smiling with their infant son in her arms. The edges of the photo were worn from years of being handled, and yet it remained the only connection he had to the life he once knew. He set the glass down and rubbed his temples. The logical part of him questioned why he had brought Maggie and the baby into his home. He could have called the authorities or arranged for a shelter. But when he'd seen her on that bench, shivering in the cold with her baby, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't explain it, but he hadn't been able to walk away. The next morning, Maggie woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The warmth of the room, the clean sheets beneath her, and the faint sound of Oliver stirring in his crib were so foreign that they felt like part of a dream. But as reality settled in, so did the uncertainty. What would happen now? How long could she stay before Ben regretted his kindness? She rose from the bed and walked to the crib, lifting Oliver into her arms. He cooed softly, his bright eyes meeting hers, and she couldn't help but smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. A soft knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, then crossed the room and opened it to find a middle-aged woman standing there, holding a tray with a steaming pot of coffee, a pitcher of orange juice, and a plate of toast and scrambled eggs. "Good morning," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Marjorie. Mr. Harrington asked me to bring you breakfast." Maggie blinked, taken aback by the gesture. "Oh, thank you." That's very kind. Marjorie stepped inside and set the tray on a small table near the window. If you need anything else, just let me know. I'm usually around. Thank you, Maggie said again, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and it only made her more aware of how out of place she felt in this house. After Marjorie left, Maggie sat at the table, balancing Oliver on her lap as she nibbled on the toast. She fed him a small bottle she had been carrying in her bag, relieved that she'd managed to save enough formula to last a few more days. As she ate, her mind raced with questions. Why was Ben helping her? What did he expect in return? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was temporary, that at any moment, she would be asked to leave. Later that morning, Ben found her in the sitting room downstairs. She was standing by the window, holding Oliver and gazing out at the snow-covered garden. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her expression guarded. "Good morning," Ben said, his voice neutral. He gestured toward the baby. "How's he doing?" "He's fine," Maggie replied. "Thank you again for everything. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't stopped." Ben shifted awkwardly and used to gratitude. "It's nothing," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. "Have you thought about what you'll do next?" Maggie hesitated, her arms tightening around Oliver. "I don't know. I've been moving from place to place, trying to stay safe. But it's hard with him." Ben nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "You don't have to figure it all out today," he said. "Take some time. Rest." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping us?" Ben met her gaze, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. But as he looked at her, at the baby in her arms, at the exhaustion etched into her features, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. "Maybe because I've been where you are," he said finally. "Not the same way, but I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like there's no way out." Maggie studied him, her expression softening. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The days in Ben's house passed in a quiet, tentative rhythm. Maggie had stayed longer than she initially expected, but the warmth and safety of the mansion were too much to give up, even temporarily. She kept a low profile, helping wherever she could and spending most of her time caring for Oliver. Despite the sprawling size of the estate, Maggie always seemed to find herself crossing paths with Ben. Their conversations were brief, but a fragile connection was forming, one that neither of them fully understood. Ben had always preferred solitude, but the sound of Oliver's occasional cries and Maggie's gentle lullabies seemed to fill the silent spaces he had grown so accustomed to. He found himself lingering in rooms where they were, pretending to read or work, but instead watching them from a distance. It wasn't just the baby's presence that stirred something in him. It was Maggie herself. There was a strength in her quiet determination that reminded him of Caroline, though he couldn't say why. One evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, Ben found Maggie in the library. She was seated on the floor with Oliver, surrounded by a small stack of children's books she had found on one of the lower shelves. Oliver babbled happily as Maggie turned the pages of a book, showing him the colorful illustrations. She looked up when she noticed Ben standing in the doorway. "Oh, I hope it's okay," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I just thought he might like the pictures." "It's fine," Ben said, stepping into the room. "Those books have been collecting dust for years. It's good to see someone enjoying them." Maggie smiled, her shoulders relaxing. "He loves stories, even if he doesn't understand them yet. It helps calm him down." Ben nodded, his gaze drifting to the baby. "He seems happy." Maggie looked down at Oliver, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I try to keep him that way, even when things are hard." There was a silence that stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth. Ben cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the moment. "Have you always been on your own?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Maggie hesitated, her fingers playing with the corner of the book. "For as long as I can remember," she said softly. "I grew up in foster care. Never really knew my parents. By the time I aged out of the system, I was just on my own." Ben frowned, leaning against the edge of the desk. "That must have been hard." It was, Maggie admitted, but I got through it. I always told myself I'd make a better life for my own family one day. Her voice caught slightly, and Ben saw the flicker of pain in her expression. He wanted to ask more, but something held him back. Instead, he gestured toward the shelves. Those books belong to my son. Maggie looked up sharply, her eyes widening. Your son? Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. Samuel. He passed away when he was a baby. A car accident on Christmas Eve. The words hung heavy in the air, and Maggie's breath caught in her throat. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. You couldn't have, Ben said, his voice gruff. It was a long time ago. Maggie watched him carefully, seeing the pain etched into his features. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, letting the silence speak for her. Over the next few days, Maggie couldn't stop thinking about what Ben had shared. It explained so much, the distance he kept, the sadness that seemed to linger in his eyes. She wanted to tell him more about her own struggles, but part of her held back, afraid of opening wounds that were still fresh. One afternoon, as she was walking through the hallway, she noticed a door slightly ajar. Inside was a small room, bright and warm, with a crib in one corner and shelves lined with toys and books. Maggie stepped inside, her heart clenching as she realized what the room was. It had been Samuel's nursery, untouched all these years. She ran her fingers over the edge of the crib, imagining the baby who had once slept there. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, as though time itself had stopped in this space. On the dresser, there was a photo of a young woman holding an infant, her smile radiant and full of life. Maggie picked it up carefully, studying the woman's face. Caroline, Ben's voice came from the doorway. Maggie turned, startled to see him standing there. He looked at the photo in her hands, his expression unreadable. She was my wife, he said, stepping into the room. She was everything. Maggie placed the photo back on the dresser, her chest tightening. You've kept this room just as it was. I couldn't bring myself to change it, Ben admitted. After they were gone, I couldn't let go. Maggie looked at him, her heart aching for the man who had lost so much. You loved them deeply. Ben nodded, his eyes distant. They were my world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maggie wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but she didn't know how. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a small gesture of understanding. You've been carrying this alone for so long, she said softly. Ben's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability behind his carefully constructed walls. It's easier that way. Maggie shook her head. Maybe, but it doesn't have to be. The words lingered in the air, and Ben felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of healing. All he knew was that Maggie's presence, and the tiny life she carried with her, had begun to fill the empty spaces in his heart. The snowstorm outside had grown heavier by evening, blanketing the estate in a shimmering layer of white. Maggie stood by the window of the sitting room, holding Oliver as she watched the swirling flakes dance against the glass. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of activity as the staff prepared dinner. It had been days since she and Oliver arrived, and though she felt safer here than she had in months, an uneasiness lingered at the edge of her thoughts. Ben entered the room quietly, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. Maggie turned at the sound of his footsteps, offering a small smile as he handed her one of the mugs. Thank you, she said softly, shifting Oliver to her other arm. Ben nodded, settling into the armchair near the fire. He sipped his tea in silence for a moment before glancing at her. How are you holding up? Maggie hesitated, then sat on the couch across from him. Better than I have in a long time, she admitted. But I'm still trying to figure out what comes next. Ben studied her, his brow furrowed. You don't have to rush into anything. You've been through a lot. You and Oliver deserve time to catch your breath. I know, Maggie said, looking down at her son, but it feels like the world doesn't wait. There's always something, some problem, some danger. It's hard to imagine things being normal. Ben leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I know what it feels like to have the world spin out of control, he said, his voice low. To feel like you're always bracing for the next blow. But you've survived so far. That's no small thing. Maggie met his gaze, her eyes softening. It hasn't been easy, she said. But I have to keep going. For him, Ben nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Maggie felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words. She hadn't heard anything like that in years. For so long, she had been told she was weak, incapable, a burden. But sitting here, in this room, with this man who barely knew her but seemed to understand, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Scene, can I ask you something?" she said after a pause. Ben raised an eyebrow. "Of course. Why did you help us that night?" Maggie asked, her voice tentative. "You didn't have to. A lot of people wouldn't have." Ben looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I don't know if I can explain it," he said after a moment. "When I saw you sitting there, holding your son, it was like something inside me woke up. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just saw someone who needed help. Someone who reminded me of what I lost." Maggie swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," she said. "I can't imagine losing so much." Ben's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than grief in his eyes, gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. Oliver stirred in Maggie's arms, his tiny hand reaching up to grab at her hair. She laughed gently, pulling his hand away and kissing his fingers. "He's a good baby," Ben said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He is," Maggie agreed. "He's my whole world." Ben nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's amazing, isn't it? How someone so small can change everything." Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Did Samuel change everything for you?" Ben's breath caught, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. "He did," he said finally. "Even in the short time I had him, he made me want to be better, to do more." Losing him, he trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Maggie reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said gently. "No," Ben said, shaking his head. "It's okay. It's just, I've kept it buried for so long. I thought that was the only way to survive. But maybe talking about it isn't so bad." Maggie nodded, her heart aching for him. "Sometimes, carrying it alone is the hardest part." Ben looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to truly see her, not just as someone who needed his help, but as someone who understood, someone who had faced her own battles and come out the other side, bruised but not broken. As the evening wore on, they talked about small things, books, memories, the town of Bethlehem itself. Maggie told him about the places she had lived, the jobs she had taken to stay afloat, and the dreams she had once dared to believe in. Ben listened, his guarded demeanor softening with every word. By the time Maggie returned to her room, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She laid Oliver down in his crib and sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the snow-covered garden. In his study, Ben sat alone, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. He picked up the photo of Caroline and Samuel, tracing the edges with his thumb. For years, he had convinced himself that his life ended the day they were taken from him. But now, with Maggie and Oliver in his house, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in decades, hope. Maggie woke to the sound of Oliver babbling in his crib, his small hands reaching for the mobile above him. She smiled, her heart filling with the kind of warmth only her son could bring. The sunlight streaming through the curtains made the room feel even more surreal, peaceful, secure, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had defined her life for so long. She lifted Oliver into her arms and held him close, savoring the moment. After feeding and dressing him, Maggie made her way downstairs, surprised to find Ben already in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread lingered in the air, and for a moment, Maggie hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to bridge the growing familiarity between them. Ben noticed her and gestured toward the table. "Good morning. I made coffee. Hope that's okay." Maggie nodded, walking into the room. "That's more than okay. Thank you." She settled Oliver into a high-backed chair Ben had found for him the day before, then sat down as Ben placed a mug of coffee in front of her. He took the seat across from her, stirring his own cup absently as he looked out the window at the snowy garden. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the soft coos of Oliver the only sound in the room. "I was thinking," Ben said finally, breaking the stillness, "about what you said last night, about not knowing what's next." Maggie glanced up, her hands tightening around her mug. "It's something I try not to think about too much," she admitted. "There's always this fear that if I stop moving, things will fall apart again." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. But maybe you don't have to figure it all out at once." Maggie tilted her head, studying him. "What do you mean?" Ben set his mug down, his fingers lacing together on the table. "I've been thinking about how I might be able to help, beyond just giving you a place to stay for a few nights. I have connections, resources. Maybe I could help you find something more permanent." Maggie's breath caught, and she looked down at Oliver, who was happily gnawing on a toy. "That's generous," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure I can accept." Ben frowned. "Why not?" She sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "Because I've spent my whole life trying not to rely on anyone. Every time I have, it's ended badly. People let you down, or they expect something in return." Ben's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Not everyone's like that, Maggie. And you don't have to do this alone. No one should." Maggie looked at him, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had built walls she wasn't sure she could tear down. Before she could respond, Oliver let out a small cry, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for him, lifting him onto her lap. Ben watched her, the ease with which she comforted her son reminding him of Caroline in her happiest moments. "You're a good mother," he said suddenly. Maggie blinked, startled by the compliment. "I try to be." "No," Ben said firmly. "You are. I can see it. You've given everything for him, even when it meant losing everything else." Her eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. "Thank you," she murmured. "That means a lot." Ben hesitated, then stood. "Why don't we take a walk?" he suggested. "The snow's let up, and the garden's beautiful this time of year." Maggie glanced at Oliver, who was already squirming in her lap, his curiosity piqued by the mention of something new. "That sounds nice." Bundled in coats and scarves, they stepped outside into the crisp winter air. The garden was a wonderland of snow-draped trees and glittering icicles, the paths freshly shoveled by the staff. Maggie carried Oliver, who giggled at the sight of his breath forming little clouds in the air, while Ben walked beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. "This place is incredible," Maggie said, her voice tinged with awe. "It feels like something out of a storybook." Ben glanced around, his expression thoughtful. "It didn't always feel that way," he admitted. "For a long time, it just felt empty." Maggie looked at him, sensing the weight behind his words. "It doesn't feel empty now." Ben met her gaze, and for a moment, the vulnerability in his eyes was unmistakable. "That's because of you," he said quietly. "You and Oliver. You've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever." Maggie's heart raced, and she looked away, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to hearing things like that, and the sincerity in Ben's voice made it even harder to process. As they continued walking, they passed a frozen pond at the edge of the garden. Ben stopped, gesturing toward it. "Caroline used to love skating here," he said, his voice distant. "She'd spend hours out here, even in the coldest weather. She always said it made her feel free." Maggie looked at him, her chest aching for the man who had endured so much loss. "She sounds like she was amazing." "She was," Ben said softly, "and for a long time, I thought I'd never feel anything again after losing her. But maybe it's time to let go of some of that." Maggie smiled gently, her hand brushing against his arm. "Maybe it is." They stood in silence for a moment, the cold air biting at their cheeks, but neither seemed to notice. The snow began to fall again, soft and delicate, and Oliver reached out a tiny hand as if trying to catch the flakes. Maggie laughed, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As they made their way back to the house, Ben felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in decades. For the first time, the memories of his past didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a foundation, a reminder of what he had loved and what he could still build. And as they stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloping them, Ben realized he wasn't just helping Maggie and Oliver. They were helping him too. The next few days passed with an ease that surprised Maggie. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of routine creeping back into her life. Mornings were spent with Oliver exploring the vast house, afternoons in the library or kitchen where Marjorie always had something warm baking, and evenings by the fire. Ben had started joining them more often, sometimes bringing books to read to Oliver or simply sitting nearby, the three of them sharing a quiet, unspoken connection. But as the calm settled, Maggie couldn't shake the lingering fear of what lay ahead. She knew this couldn't last forever. Ben's generosity had given her and Oliver a reprieve, but it wasn't a solution. And there was the other matter, the one she hadn't spoken about yet. The reason she had been on that bench in the first place. One evening, as Oliver slept soundly in the guest room crib, Maggie sat alone in the sitting room, staring at the flickering fire. The weight of her thoughts pressed heavily on her chest. She didn't hear Ben enter until he cleared his throat softly. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression curious. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Maggie shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Ben stepped closer, taking the armchair across from her. "Anything you want to talk about?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, keeping the truth to herself. But she was tired of running, tired of carrying the burden alone. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the flames. "There's something I haven't told you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that makes all of this, staying here, feeling safe, feel temporary." Ben's brow furrowed, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" Maggie swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Oliver's father. He's the reason we ended up on that bench. I was running from him." Ben leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Is he dangerous?" "Yes," Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's controlling, manipulative. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would change things. I thought maybe he'd become the person he pretended to be when we first met. But it only got worse. He wanted to control everything. What I did, who I saw, even what I thought. And when Oliver was born," her voice broke, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "I knew I had to leave." Ben's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "Did he hurt you?" Maggie nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over a faint scar on her wrist. "Not just me. He threatened Oliver too. That's when I knew I couldn't stay." Ben's expression darkened, his protective instincts flaring. "Does he know where you are?" "No," Maggie said quickly. "At least, I don't think so. I've been careful. I've changed phones, avoided places he might look. But he has resources, connections. He's persistent." Ben sat back, his mind racing. He couldn't imagine the fear Maggie must have felt, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if it was safe to take a single step forward. The thought of someone hurting her, or Oliver, ignited a fury in him he hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to worry," he said firmly. "You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." Maggie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and doubt. "I don't want to put you in danger." "He's not the kind of man who gives up easily." Ben's gaze hardened. "Let him try. I have more than enough resources to keep you safe. And if he comes near you or Oliver, he'll regret it." Maggie's breath caught, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel, hope. But it was tempered by the reality of her situation. She didn't want to rely on Ben, not completely. She needed to find a way to stand on her own feet, to build a life where she and Oliver could be free from fear. "I appreciate everything you've done for us," she said softly. "More than I can ever say." But I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out what comes next. Ben studied her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to rush into anything. Take the time you need. We'll figure it out together. The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, made Maggie's heart ache. She wasn't used to people offering her support without expecting something in return. It felt both comforting and terrifying, like stepping into uncharted territory. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The conversation shifted after that, moving to lighter topics as they both tried to ease the tension that had settled between them. Ben told her stories about the town, about the traditions he and Caroline used to love, and Maggie found herself laughing for the first time in weeks. The sound surprised her, and she saw a flicker of satisfaction in Ben's eyes, as though her laughter was a small victory. As the fire burned lower, Ben walked her back to the guest room. He lingered in the doorway as she checked on Oliver, who was still sleeping soundly. Maggie turned to him, her expression soft. "Good night, Ben." "Good night, Maggie," he said, his voice warm. "Try to get some rest." She nodded, closing the door gently behind him. For a long time, she stood in the room, staring at the crib where Oliver slept. The quiet felt different tonight, less like an absence and more like a reprieve. She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and let herself drift into a peaceful sleep for the first time in as long as she could remember. In his own room, Ben sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. His mind was racing, replaying everything Maggie had told him. He couldn't shake the image of her on that bench, clutching Oliver, desperate and alone. She had been through so much, and yet she had survived, carrying her son through the storm with a strength he could hardly comprehend. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ben made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would protect Maggie and Oliver. Not just from the man she was running from, but from the uncertainty that had defined her life. He didn't fully understand why he felt so strongly about her, whether it was guilt, compassion, or something more. But he knew one thing for certain. Maggie and Oliver had given him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. And he wasn't about to let that go. The snow glistened in the morning light as Maggie stood by the window, cradling Oliver. The world outside was beautiful, pristine, untouched by the fears that lingered in her heart. She had spent the better part of the night replaying her conversation with Ben, wondering if she had done the right thing by opening up to him. Part of her felt relief. Finally, someone understood the weight she carried. But another part worried about what it might mean. Would he think less of her? Regret offering his help? She shook the thoughts away, focusing instead on Oliver, who reached for her face with his tiny hands. She kissed his fingers, a small smile breaking through her worry. He was her reason for everything, and as long as he was safe, she could face whatever came next. Downstairs, Ben was on the phone, pacing the length of his study. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke, detailing instructions to someone on the other end. The call ended, and he stood by the window, looking out at the same snowy landscape Maggie had been admiring. He had spent the morning making arrangements, discreet calls to contacts who specialized in security, people he trusted to help ensure Maggie and Oliver would be protected. He didn't share her hesitation about accepting help. He had the means to shield them, and he was determined to use them. Marjorie knocked lightly on the doorframe, breaking his thoughts. "Breakfast is ready, Mr. Harrington." "Thank you, Marjorie," Ben said. "And make sure Maggie knows she's welcome to join." Marjorie smiled knowingly. "She'll be down soon. That little one has been keeping her busy this morning." Ben chuckled softly, the image of Oliver's curious, bright-eyed face bringing a rare warmth to his expression. He followed Marjorie into the dining room, where the table was set with an array of breakfast dishes. Not long after, Maggie appeared, Oliver balanced on her hip. She hesitated for a moment at the doorway, then stepped inside. "Good morning," Ben said, rising from his seat. "Morning," Maggie replied, offering him a small smile. She adjusted Oliver in her arms, then looked at the spread on the table. "This looks incredible." "Marjorie's work," Ben said, motioning for her to sit. "She insists on making enough to feed an army, even though there are only 3 of us." Maggie laughed softly as she settled Oliver into a high chair. "I'm not complaining. It smells amazing." As they ate, The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Ben asked about Oliver's milestones, marveling at how quickly babies seemed to grow, while Maggie shared stories about his first giggles and the small joys of watching him discover the world. It felt easy, natural, like a family sharing a meal. For a brief moment, Maggie let herself believe it could be real. After breakfast, Ben suggested they take a walk into town. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a perfect winter day, and he thought it might be good for Maggie to see more of Bethlehem. She hesitated at first, worried about being seen, but Ben assured her that no one would ask questions. This was his town, and the people here respected his privacy and those under his care. Bundled up against the cold, they strolled along the snow-dusted streets, Oliver tucked snugly in a baby carrier against Maggie's chest. The town was alive with the spirit of Christmas. Shop windows displayed festive decorations, and the air was filled with the sound of carolers singing on the corner. Children ran ahead of their parents, clutching steaming cups of cocoa, while couples lingered under the mistletoe hung between lampposts. Maggie couldn't remember the last time she had felt this kind of joy. She watched as Ben greeted townsfolk with polite nods and warm smiles, his presence commanding respect but never arrogance. People seemed to admire him, and she began to understand why. Beneath his reserved exterior, Ben was a man who cared deeply, more deeply than he let on. They stopped at a small cafe, where Ben ordered them both hot chocolate. Maggie sat at a corner table, rocking Oliver gently as he began to drift off to sleep. Ben returned with 2 steaming mugs and sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "It's nice here," Maggie said, glancing out the window at the bustling street. "It feels safe." "It is," Ben replied. "That's one of the reasons I stayed. After everything that happened, I needed a place that felt like home." Maggie looked at him, her eyes soft. "And does it?" Ben hesitated, then nodded. "It does now." They sipped their drinks in comfortable silence, the warmth of the cocoa spreading through them as the snow sparkled outside. Maggie felt a quiet contentment settle over her, a rare feeling she wasn't sure how to hold on to. But as she glanced at Ben, she realized he felt it too. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The walk back to the estate was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow. Maggie felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years, the kind that came from being surrounded by kindness and warmth. She glanced at Ben as they approached the house, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. Ben looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For all of this," Maggie said, gesturing around them. "For giving us a place to stay, for making us feel safe. I don't think I've ever said it properly, but thank you." Ben stopped walking, turning to face her fully. His expression was serious, but his eyes held a softness that made her breath catch. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "You and Oliver have brought something back into my life I thought I'd lost forever. If anything, I should be thanking you." Maggie felt her cheeks flush, and she looked away, unsure of how to respond. The sincerity in his voice was almost overwhelming, and for a moment, she wondered if he could see the tears brimming in her eyes. Back inside the house, they settled into their familiar routine. Maggie tending to Oliver while Ben retreated to his study. But as the evening wore on, they found themselves drawn back to the sitting room, where the fire crackled softly and the glow of the Christmas tree filled the space with a warm, golden light. Ben sat in his usual chair, a book resting on his lap, while Maggie rocked Oliver to sleep nearby. The room was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time, it felt like home. Maggie glanced at Ben, her heart full, and realized she wasn't just grateful for the safety he had given her. She was grateful for him. The snow had started again by the time Maggie woke the next morning. She stood by the window of the guest room, holding Oliver as she watched the world outside transform into a flurry of white. It felt surreal, this quiet life they'd found, so different from the chaos and fear that had chased them before. For the first time, Maggie allowed herself to think about what it might mean to stay, to let this place and the man who had given them sanctuary become something more permanent. But the thought was as terrifying as it was comforting. What if it didn't last? What if the walls she'd built around her heart came down, only to leave her exposed again. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Ben standing in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. He offered her a small smile. "Good morning," he said. "I thought you might like some tea." Maggie smiled back, motioning him inside. "Thank you. That sounds perfect." Ben crossed the room and handed her a mug, glancing briefly at Oliver, who had started to drift off in her arms. "He's got a good sense of timing," Ben said, nodding toward the baby. "Always asleep when there's a moment to relax." Maggie laughed softly. "He does have a knack for that." Ben hesitated, then gestured toward the small armchair near the window. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not," Maggie said, settling into a chair of her own. She cradled the mug in her free hand, the warmth seeping into her fingers. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, watching the snow fall outside. Then Ben spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night," he began. "About not knowing what comes next." Maggie looked at him, her chest tightening. "It's something I've been trying to figure out," she admitted. "I want to give Oliver a stable life, but it's hard to imagine how to get there." Ben nodded, his gaze distant. "I've spent a lot of time wondering the same thing. Not for the same reasons, obviously, but after losing Caroline and Samuel, I didn't know how to move forward. Everything felt impossible." Maggie watched him carefully, the vulnerability in his voice tugging at her heart. "What helped?" she asked gently. Ben met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Time, mostly, but also finding a reason, something or someone to fight for." Maggie's breath caught, and she looked away, unsure of how to respond. Ben's words echoed in her mind, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. She thought of Oliver, of the way he looked at her with such trust and innocence, and she realized she had found her reason. But could she truly let Ben be part of that? Could she trust him to stay, to be the kind of person Oliver needed in his life? "I don't know what I'd do without him," Maggie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's the only thing that keeps me going some days." Ben leaned forward, his expression soft. "You're stronger than you think, Maggie. You've already done so much for him, and you don't have to do it alone." Maggie looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It's hard to believe that sometimes," she admitted. "After everything we've been through, trusting someone else feels impossible." Ben reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that made Maggie's heart ache. "You don't have to trust me right away," he said, "but I want to help, and I'll be here as long as you need me." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time, Maggie felt a crack in the walls she'd built around herself. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around his. "Thank you," she said softly. The moment lingered between them, quiet and full of unspoken meaning. Then Oliver stirred in her arms, his tiny fist reaching for her face, and the spell was broken. Maggie laughed softly, shifting him to a more comfortable position. "He has impeccable timing," Ben said, his lips curving into a smile. "That he does," Maggie replied, her own smile lingering. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet activity. Maggie spent time in the library, reading to Oliver while Ben worked in his study. They shared lunch together in the dining room, the conversation easy and light, and by the time evening came, Maggie found herself looking forward to the quiet moments by the fire. But as they settled into their usual spots in the sitting room, something felt different. The air between them was charged with an unspoken energy, a sense of possibility that neither of them knew how to address. Maggie rocked Oliver gently in her arms, her eyes fixed on the fire as Ben sat across from her, his book forgotten in his lap. "I've been thinking about something," Ben said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Maggie looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Ben hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the arm of his chair. "I've been trying to figure out how to help you and Oliver," he said, "and I realized I don't just want to help. I want to be part of your lives." Maggie's breath caught, and she stared at him, her mind racing. "Ben, I don't know if—" "I'm not asking for an answer right now," he said quickly, his tone earnest. I want you to know that I care about you, both of you, and I want to be here for you." In whatever way you'll let me." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I've been on my own for so long. Letting someone in. It's terrifying." "I know," Ben said softly, "and I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. But I hope you'll think about it." Maggie nodded, her fingers brushing against Oliver's soft hair. "I will," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. They sat together, the firelight casting long shadows across the room, and for the first time, Maggie allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to do it all alone. As the night wore on, Ben walked her back to the guest room. He lingered in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Good night, Maggie," he said, his voice warm. "Good night, Ben," she replied, her heart full of conflicting emotions. When the door closed, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She looked down at Oliver, who was fast asleep, his tiny face peaceful and untroubled. For his sake, she knew she had to be brave. And for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could be. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet stillness, the kind that only a fresh blanket of snow could bring. Maggie stood in the kitchen, helping Marjorie prepare a tray of cookies while Oliver sat in his high chair, babbling happily to himself. The atmosphere in the house felt different, lighter, as if the festive spirit had finally taken root in its walls. For the first time in years, Maggie felt something close to excitement. It was subtle, tentative, but it was there. A sense of anticipation for what the day might bring. Ben entered the kitchen, a scarf draped loosely around his neck, and smiled at the scene. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. Maggie looked up and returned his smile. "Good morning. Marjorie's been teaching me how to make her famous gingerbread cookies." "Famous, huh?" Ben teased, raising an eyebrow at Marjorie, who waved him off with a laugh. "They're not famous," Marjorie said, rolling out another batch of dough, "but they're a tradition. Someone has to learn how to make them, and Maggie here is a quick study." Maggie flushed slightly, but there was pride in her expression. She glanced at Oliver, who was gnawing on a piece of soft bread Marjorie had given him. "He seems to approve of the kitchen activity." Ben chuckled, stepping closer to tickle Oliver's cheek. The baby laughed, a sound so pure and joyful it made Maggie's heart swell. Ben glanced at Maggie, their eyes meeting briefly before he turned to the tray of cookies. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing to the neatly decorated cookies lined up on a cooling rack. "They look great." Maggie laughed softly. "I wouldn't say great, but they're passable." "They're better than passable," Marjorie interjected. "And you're too modest." The easy camaraderie in the kitchen filled Maggie with a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. This felt normal, like the life she had always dreamed of but never thought she could have. And yet, the thought was tinged with a quiet fear. She couldn't help but wonder if it was all too good to be true. Later that afternoon, Ben surprised her by inviting her and Oliver to join him for a walk to the church in town. The annual Christmas Eve service was a tradition in Bethlehem, a celebration of community and hope. Maggie hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to be seen so publicly, but Ben reassured her. "The people here aren't nosy," he said gently. "They'll respect your privacy. But it's a beautiful service, and I think you'll enjoy it." Maggie finally agreed, bundling Oliver in a warm coat and hat before they set out. The walk to the church was magical, the snow falling softly around them as the town's Christmas lights twinkled in the fading daylight. Ben carried Oliver part of the way, his steady presence beside her giving her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. The church was warm and inviting, filled with the soft glow of candlelight. Maggie sat near the back with Ben, Oliver nestled in her lap. The music, the voices of the choir, and the gentle hum of the congregation wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. After the service, Ben introduced her to a few townsfolk who greeted her with kindness but didn't pry. Maggie felt her nerves begin to ease as she realized he had been right. This wasn't a place of judgment, but of welcome. As they walked back to the estate, the town square was alive with laughter and music, and Maggie couldn't help but smile at the sight of children chasing each other around a giant, beautifully lit Christmas tree. That evening, back at the house, Ben lit a fire in the sitting room while Maggie settled Oliver into his crib. When she returned, she found Ben standing by the Christmas tree, holding a small ornament in his hand. It was a simple piece of wood carved into the shape of a star, with the name Samuel etched into it. "This was his," Ben said quietly as Maggie approached. "Caroline had it made for his first Christmas." Maggie's chest tightened, her heart aching for the man who had endured so much loss. She reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his. "It's beautiful." Ben nodded, his gaze distant. "I've kept it packed away for years. I couldn't bring myself to put it on the tree, but this year feels different." Maggie smiled softly, her fingers lingering on his arm. "Because it is." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You've changed everything, Maggie. You and Oliver. You've brought life back into this house, into my life." Maggie's breath caught, her emotions swirling as she looked at him. "Ben, I don't even know what to say. You've given us so much. I can't even begin to." He stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you. You reminded me that it's okay to hope again." Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes, and she looked down, her voice trembling. "I've been so afraid to trust anyone, to believe in anything. But you've made it easier." Ben reached out, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. You're not alone, Maggie. Not anymore." The sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his gaze, broke through the last of her defenses. Maggie stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "I don't know what the future looks like," she said softly, "but I know I want it to be here, with you." Ben smiled, a genuine, heartfelt expression that lit up his face. "Then that's all that matters." They stood there for a moment, the glow of the fire and the twinkling lights of the tree surrounding them. Oliver stirred faintly in the other room, his tiny cries breaking the stillness. Maggie laughed, stepping back. "I think someone doesn't want to miss out on the moment." Ben chuckled. "He has impeccable timing, as always." Maggie disappeared briefly to tend to Oliver, returning with him bundled in a soft blanket. She sat on the couch, holding him close as Ben joined her, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire as the snow fell gently outside. For the first time in years, Maggie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. This was home, not just the house, but the people in it. She glanced at Ben, who was gazing at Oliver with a look of pure affection, and her heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet joy, the promise of new beginnings woven into every moment. As Maggie and Ben exchanged small gifts, their laughter echoing through the house, it felt like the start of something neither of them had dared to dream of. Maggie knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Together, they could face whatever came next. Because together, they had found what they had both been searching for: a family, a home, and the hope of a brighter tomorrow.